The rolling hills beside the Little Bighorn River in Montana hold memories of one of America's most famous and tragic battles. On June 25th to 26th, 1876, the U.S. 7th Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, suffered a crushing defeat against Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. This event, known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, has been told for over a century as a story of heroism and sacrifice. However, modern research tells a much darker and more complicated story, filled with panic, mistakes, and a desperate fight for survival. For many years, people believed that Custer and his men bravely fought to the last man, standing their ground against an overwhelming enemy. This idea was spread through books, movies, and patriotic stories, making Custer seem like a fearless leader who never gave up. However, this version of events is far from the truth. If Custer was such a skilled cavalry officer, how did he and his men suffer such a devastating defeat? The traditional answer has been that they were outnumbered, but in reality, Custer made critical mistakes. He underestimated the strength and determination of the native warriors and made poor tactical decisions. Instead of an organized last stand, the battle was a chaotic massacre, with soldiers scattered, terrified, and desperately trying to escape. Modern archaeology has helped uncover what truly took place that day. Using forensic techniques, similar to crime scene investigations, researchers have studied spent bullets, skeletal remains, and battlefield positions to piece together a more accurate version of events. The evidence shows that the battle was not a single fight in one place. Instead, it was a series of smaller battles spread across a large area. Custer's troops were not standing their ground in an orderly defense. Instead, they were cut off from one another, overwhelmed in small groups, and taken down systematically by native warriors who outnumbered them. Bullet patterns suggest that many soldiers did not fight until the last bullet, but instead tried to run. The famous Last Stand at Last Stand Hill was likely one of the final moments of an already lost battle, with soldiers making a desperate but hopeless attempt to regroup. Despite the grim reality, the legend of Custer's bravery continues to be retold. Every year, the town of Hardin, Montana, reenacts the battle, often exaggerating the courage of Custer and his men, while ignoring the true history. Hollywood has also played a major role in keeping this myth alive, portraying Custer as a fearless, self-sacrificing leader, rather than a reckless commander who made fatal mistakes. For the Native American tribes who fought at Little Bighorn, Custer was not a heroic figure. He was an aggressor leading a campaign to take their lands. Yet, he was turned into a tragic war hero in American culture. Before the battle, Custer was famous for his exploits in the Civil War, known for his flashy personality and bold, sometimes reckless tactics. His dramatic death only added to his legend, since there were no survivors from his immediate command. People could imagine his final moments however they wanted, shaping the story into a noble sacrifice rather than a disaster. The U.S. government and the media quickly turned Custer's defeat into a story of bravery and honor. At a time when the country was still recovering from the Civil War, the image of a heroic cavalry officer fighting against impossible odds was appealing. However, this version of history ignored the accounts of those there, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who won the battle. For years, the accounts of Native American warriors who participated in the battle were dismissed or ignored. However, Their oral histories tell a very different story. Chaos, confusion, and panic among the cavalry, with no grand last stand. Joe Medicine Crow, a historian and the last war chief of the Crow Nation, recounted stories passed down from his grandfather, White Man Runs Him, who had been one of Custer's scouts. According to these accounts, the battle was so widespread that no single person could have witnessed everything. Still, the general theme remained consistent. Custer's men were overwhelmed and slaughtered in a disorganized retreat rather than making a heroic final stand. According to Lakota and Cheyenne witnesses, Custer's men were exhausted, outmaneuvered, and demoralized long before the final engagement. Some soldiers reportedly threw down their weapons and tried to escape on foot, only to be cut down. Others were so disoriented that they fired wildly, wasting ammunition. These accounts contradict the image of disciplined soldiers holding their ground until the last bullet. For decades, these native testimonies were largely ignored because they did not fit the patriotic narrative. However, modern forensic research is increasingly validating these accounts, proving that Custer's troops were likely in disarray long before the battle ended. The Battle of the Little Bighorn did not occur in isolation. It was part of a larger campaign to subdue the Northern Plains tribes and force them onto reservations. By the mid-1870s, Native American resistance was seen as an obstacle to westward expansion, and the U.S. government sought to eliminate that threat. Sitting Bull, a revered Sioux leader, understood this was a survival fight. He called upon various Sioux and Cheyenne bands to unite in one last stand against the U.S. military. His famous words, "Come back, come to my camp for the last big fight. It will be a good day to die," reflects the determination of Native warriors to defend their way of life. In the aftermath of the battle, the bodies of Custer and his men were found where they fell, their positions marked by makeshift burials. Today, white marble markers stand across the battlefield, commemorating the fallen soldiers in the exact spots where they died. The most well-known site is Last Stand Hill, where approximately 40 markers cluster together, reinforcing the traditional story of a heroic final stand. However, as one moves across the battlefield, a different picture emerges. Scattered markers stretch across miles of terrain, suggesting that many soldiers were attempting to flee rather than standing their ground. The trail of death leads to Deep Ravine, where numerous bodies were found in a last, desperate attempt at escape. For many years, people have debated what happened when Native American warriors defeated General Custer and his men. We now have a clearer picture of the battle thanks to archaeologists Douglas Scott and Richard Fox. By studying bullets, bones, and other objects left behind, they have pieced together the real story of Custer's last stand. Archaeologists treat old battlefields like crime scenes. Every bullet, piece of equipment, or bone they find helps them figure out what happened. Even though the soldiers who died cannot tell their stories, their remains give us important clues. One of the biggest discoveries was near Marker 128, where archaeologists found the bones of a young soldier, likely between 19 and 21 years old. His injuries showed just how brutal the battle was. His jaw had been smashed so badly that his teeth broke in half. His collarbone had deep cuts, probably from a knife, and his leg bones appeared to have been struck with an axe. The soldier had also been shot multiple times. A bullet was found lodged in his wrist, and there were gunshot wounds in his chest. Some of these shots were likely fired from a distance, but when the battle got close, It seemed the attackers finished him off with a final blow to the head. This discovery proved that Native American warriors were not only using traditional weapons like knives and axes, but they also had guns. Another skeleton helped archaeologists identify a specific soldier. His bones had a gunshot wound in the hip, with tiny metal fragments still inside. This type of injury would have been fatal in the 1870s because doctors didn't have the medical tools to treat serious gut wounds. Records from the battle tell us that a soldier named Vincent Charlie was found dead with a hip wound, and something shocking, a stick had been jammed down his throat. Because of this gruesome detail, archaeologists believe these remains belong to him. His bones tell the story of his tragic death and the brutality of the battle. Since no photos of Vincent Charlie exist, forensic artist Betty Pat Gatliff is working to reconstruct his face. This is a technique often used in crime investigations to help identify victims. Though we already know who killed Charlie, reconstructing his face helps us connect with the past more humanly. The battle happened because the U.S. government wanted to force Native American tribes onto reservations. On May 17, 1876, 3 groups of soldiers entered Montana to confront these tribes. Custer's job was to locate them. On June 25th, his scouts spotted a large Native American village near the Little Bighorn River. One scout, White Man Runs Him, warned Custer that there were too many warriors, but Custer ignored the warning and prepared to attack. Instead of keeping his troops together, Custer split his 600 men into 3 groups. This made them weaker. He sent Captain Benteen south, ordered Captain Reno to attack the village, and took 210 men with him toward the hills. When he finally saw the entire village, he realized it was much bigger than expected. Over 1,500 warriors were ready to fight. Witnesses say his face went pale when he saw the size of the camp. Even after his scouts warned him to wait for reinforcements, he continued. As Reno's attack failed and Benteen's group was too far away to help, Custer and his men found themselves trapped and outnumbered. Just before the final battle, Custer told his scouts to leave, knowing they would be killed if they stayed. His interpreter, Mitch Boyer, translated his last warning. "Boys, you better get away from here as fast as possible. I'm stuck." One of the few people to survive was White Man Runs Him, the grandfather of historian Joe Medicine Crow. He escaped the battle and later passed down what he had seen. Meanwhile, Custer and his men rode into history, meeting their tragic fate. Over 100 years later, archaeologists arrived at the battlefield with metal detectors. The first day of searching revealed incredible finds: bullets, spent cartridges, and even pieces of personal gear. These discoveries helped map out where soldiers fired their weapons and where they fell. One key finding was spent cartridges from Henry rifles, high-quality repeating rifles that native warriors used. These were better than the single-shot rifles Custer's men carried, giving the native warriors a big advantage. One discovery was a wedding band still on a soldier's finger bone. This tiny object was a powerful reminder that these men were not just soldiers. They were husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers. Their deaths were not just a military loss, but a personal tragedy for their families. Douglas Scott and Richard Fox's work has given us a clearer, more accurate version of history. Scientists have uncovered thousands of bullets, cartridge cases, and other artifacts from the battlefield. By studying them, they've been able to map out the movements of soldiers and warriors, showing where they fought, where they fell, and even how their weapons were used. Each bullet and shell casing found at Little Bighorn was carefully numbered, recorded, and added to a computerized map of the battlefield. This helped researchers piece together what happened during the fight. Even today, much more remains buried beneath the ground, waiting to be discovered. One exciting find was a .45 caliber Springfield carbine round near Last Stand Hill. This bullet was unfired and perfect, even after over 125 years. It was a rare find, but not unusual. Soldiers in battle often dropped bullets due to stress, confusion, or weapon malfunctions. The U.S. Army issued .45 caliber Springfield carbines and pistols to the 7th Cavalry, making it easy to identify their bullets. But archaeologists also found hundreds of other bullets that didn't match these weapons. These bullets had to come from Native American warriors' guns. Scientists could see how the battle played out by looking at where different bullets were found. Trooper bullets were found near Native American positions, while Native American bullets were found at soldier positions. This pattern showed where each side was shooting from and gave valuable clues about their movements. One of the biggest surprises was the number of Native American bullets and cartridge cases. Historians once believed most Native warriors fought with bows and arrows, but battlefield evidence showed otherwise. Researchers discovered that at least 47 different types of firearms were used by Native warriors, including muzzle loaders, old flintlocks, and advanced repeating rifles. This meant that over 800 warriors had guns, and they outgunned Custer's men 4-1. Where did the Native Americans get their guns? So, how did Native warriors get so many guns? The answer is simple: trade. Native Americans bought or traded for firearms just like anyone else. They got them from trading posts and fur traders, and even captured them from soldiers. They preferred lightweight, fast-firing weapons like the 1866 Winchester repeating rifle, which allowed them to shoot quickly, almost like firing arrows. Some warriors modified their guns, sawing off barrels to make them easier to handle in close combat. Revolvers were also popular because they were lightweight, easy to carry, and could fire multiple rounds quickly. While bullets told part of the story, the real clues came from the cartridge cases. When a gun fires, it leaves unique marks on the cartridge case, almost like a fingerprint. By matching these marks, scientists could tell if two bullets were fired from the same gun, even if they were found far apart on the battlefield. Archaeologist Douglas Scott examined over 1,500 cartridge cases and found that some had identical markings but were discovered hundreds of yards apart. This meant the same gun had been used in different locations. For example, one matching set of cartridge cases was found at Calhoun Hill and Last Stand Hill, about a quarter-mile apart. This suggested that either a soldier had run across the battlefield with the gun, or, more likely, the gun had been captured by a native warrior and turned against the 7th Cavalry. For a long time, people believed the Native American warriors only had bows and arrows, and that they won simply because they had more fighters. But archaeological evidence proved otherwise. The native warriors had a huge advantage in firepower and used various weapons to defeat Custer's men. Custer's troops were outgunned and outnumbered. They fought bravely, but were up against warriors with more guns, ammunition, and better battlefield tactics than history once suggested. Instead of standing in one place and exchanging gunfire, Native American warriors fought in a way that made them harder to hit. They would hide behind natural barriers like ridges and gullies, quickly pop up to fire a shot, then move to another position before the soldiers could return fire. This made them difficult targets and allowed them to surround Custer's men from multiple directions. Bullets from the same weapons were found in several places, showing that warriors were constantly moving. This gave them a huge advantage over the 7th Cavalry, whose soldiers fought in a much more rigid and predictable way. Custer's troops were not the elite, well-trained soldiers some history books describe. Many were young, inexperienced, and physically unfit for battle. Most were immigrants from Ireland, England, and Germany, hoping for a better life in America. Their diet was poor, and they suffered from health problems like arthritis and rotting teeth, even though they were only in their 20s. By the time they arrived at Little Bighorn, they were already exhausted. They had been traveling on horseback for months with a little rest, and were in no shape for a fast-moving fight. This lack of energy and physical strength likely made it even harder for them to react to the warriors' quick attacks. Custer's battle strategy involved splitting his forces into 2 groups. His group moved toward the river, while another, led by Captain Miles Keogh, stayed on higher ground. As Custer's troops moved, they ran into some resistance, but at first, the fight wasn't intense. Most of the Native American warriors were still busy fighting another group of U.S. soldiers under Major Reno to the south. But as Indian women and children fled north, Custer and his 80 men chased after them. At the same time, Keogh and his 120 soldiers held their position near a small hill. The battle was still long range, with soldiers and warriors exchanging gunfire from a distance. But then, the fight turned for the worse for Custer's troops. Custer's men were trained to fight using a skirmish line method. This meant that when they arrived at the battlefield, they would get off their horses and spread out in a long line, standing about 5 yards apart. 3 out of every 4 soldiers would prepare to fire while the 4th man held their horses a little back. This strategy was designed to make the soldiers harder to hit while keeping their firepower organized. The problem? This tactic worked well in traditional battles, but was useless against warriors who didn't fight predictably. Native American fighters didn't attack head-on. They came from all directions, quickly moving behind ridges and hills to avoid gunfire. By looking at where bullets were found, archaeologists discovered evidence that some of Custer's soldiers did try to form a skirmish line on Calhoun Hill, but this defensive position didn't hold up for long. Native American warriors were able to climb onto a ridge and fire down on the soldiers, who had nowhere to hide. The scattered remains of cartridge cases show that the soldiers were quickly overwhelmed and didn't have time to reposition themselves. The Native American warriors won the battle because they were faster, used the land wisely, and fought in a way Custer's men weren't prepared for. Instead of standing in one place like the soldiers, they kept moving, making themselves harder to hit. They took advantage of the ridges, gullies, and hills to stay hidden while still being able to shoot. Meanwhile, exhausted and unprepared, Custer's soldiers stuck to old battle tactics that didn't work in this kind of fight. Their skirmish lines and defensive positions couldn't stop the fast-moving warriors, and their lack of movement made them easy targets. Native American warriors didn't need orders from a commander to tell them what to do. They were natural hunters and fighters, trained from a young age to track, stalk, and attack quickly and precisely. Whether hunting buffalo or fighting in tribal wars, they developed strong instincts that made them dangerous in battle. They fought up close and personal, using weapons designed for hand-to-hand combat. Their lances, war clubs, tomahawks, and bows allowed them to strike quickly and effectively. Even when they used guns, they often preferred traditional weapons because they could fight more efficiently with them. Riding horses was a huge advantage for native warriors. they could hang off the side of their horses to protect themselves while attacking their enemies on the ground. They aimed to disarm their opponents by breaking their wrists and then finishing them off with a deadly blow to the head. Their fighting style was fast, aggressive, and unpredictable. Instead of fighting to hold ground, they used hit-and-run tactics to weaken their enemies and keep them on edge. The U.S. cavalry, on the other hand, fought in a much more structured way. Soldiers were trained to follow strict orders, move in formations, and rely on firearms such as carbines and pistols to fight from a distance. Their training was based on European-style warfare, which worked well against organized armies, but not against the fast-moving native warriors. One big problem with cavalry tactics was their reliance on horses. If they had to fight on foot, they lost their speed and became easy targets. Also, since some soldiers had to stay behind to hold the horses, a unit immediately lost 1/4 of its firepower when they dismounted. Another issue was that cavalry soldiers weren't trained to think for themselves in battle. They were used to following orders, so many didn't know what to do when their formations broke down. Unlike native warriors, who could instantly adapt to any situation, cavalry soldiers often panicked when things went wrong. The U.S. Army was trained to fight enemies like the French or Prussians, organized armies that followed the same rules of war. But native warriors didn't fight like that. They didn't stand in neat lines and wait to be shot at. Instead, they attacked from unexpected directions, retreated when necessary, and used the land to their advantage. The Army's rigid thinking left them unprepared for this kind of combat. Officers were slow to react, and soldiers struggled when they were out of formation. The cavalry found itself at a serious disadvantage in open battles, where speed and adaptability were crucial. A perfect example of these problems happened during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. As native warriors attacked, Captain Miles Keogh and his men tried to hold their position, but their usual tactics didn't work. The soldiers couldn't match the speed and intensity of the warriors, and soon their lines began to break apart. About 40 cavalrymen attempted to escape at one point, but the warriors quickly counterattacked and drove them back. As fear set in, the soldiers lost all sense of order. Native accounts described them shooting wildly in the air instead of aiming at their enemies. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield confirms what happened next. When soldiers were still following orders, their spent bullets were found in neat lines, meaning they were fighting in formation. But in other areas, the bullets are scattered in tight clusters, showing that the soldiers were bunching together in fear rather than holding their positions. This was a deadly mistake. Unlike native warriors, who fought independently and could survive even if separated, cavalrymen needed to stay in formation to protect each other. Once they panicked and huddled together, they became easy targets. The warriors quickly took advantage, closing in and finishing them off. Another big issue for the cavalry was that some soldiers were on horseback, while others were on foot. Those on foot were much slower and more vulnerable, while those still on horses couldn't easily help them. This made it difficult for the cavalry to fight as one unit. At Calhoun Hill, this weakness became obvious. As the right wing collapsed, soldiers tried to escape, but the warriors quickly caught up and attacked because they weren't moving together. Some tried to reach Custer's left wing, but the battle was already lost. The archaeological evidence shows how desperate the final moments were. Captain Keogh's company. I made its last stand at Calhoun Hill, but the overwhelming number of native warriors meant they had little chance. The spent bullets found at the site show that it was a one-sided fight. A few shots came from the soldiers, while the area was littered with native bullets. The last survivors of the right wing ran toward Custer's left wing, but they were quickly surrounded and wiped out. The battle had turned into a massacre, with the native warriors using their superior tactics and close combat skills to destroy the cavalry forces. Native American warriors who witnessed the battle described it as a one-sided slaughter. They saw soldiers firing wildly in all directions, some pretending to be dead in hopes of being spared. One warrior compared it to a stampede of buffalo, chaos as the soldiers ran for their lives. For many years, historians thought the positions of fallen soldiers showed they fought in an organized skirmish line. However, the Custer myth influenced this idea, which painted them as brave men holding their ground until the last bullet. The truth is much grimmer. By the time Custer's men reached their final position, they had already lost half their force. One major factor in the battle's outcome was the weapons each side used. The 7th Cavalry was armed with the 1873 Springfield carbine, a powerful but slow-loading rifle. It was effective at long distances, up to 700 yards, but soldiers could only fire a few rounds per minute. The native warriors, however, had Henry repeating rifles, which could fire much faster, up to 10 shots in just a few seconds. While these rifles were most effective within 200 yards, that was all they needed. Once the warriors got close, the cavalry was in serious trouble. Archaeologists have found evidence that the native warriors had at least 200 repeating rifles. At the start of the fight, the cavalry had the advantage with their long-range Springfields, but the repeating rifles became far more effective as the warriors got closer. This explains why Custer's right wing collapsed so quickly. The soldiers, unable to match the warriors' rapid fire, were gunned down as they tried to retreat. Out of 120 men, only 20 made it to Custer's final position on Last Stand Hill. When the survivors reached Custer, only 105 men remained, half of the original force. At this point, any hope of winning was gone. The soldiers switched from attacking to defending, but they were surrounded. To make things worse, native warriors now had Springfield carbines they had taken from fallen soldiers. These guns were turned against Custer's remaining men, making the fight even more uneven. At some point, a group of 40 soldiers on foot, along with 5 to 9 mounted riders, tried to escape toward the river. But Crazy Horse and his warriors had already sealed off the battlefield. The soldiers never made it. Realizing their only chance was to run, some troopers dropped their weapons and sprinted toward the river, but they were surrounded. A Northern Cheyenne warrior named Big Beaver later described the final moments. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors came from all sides. We had them surrounded. In a little while, they were all dead. By the time the battle was over, no soldier in Custer's command had survived. Last Stand Hill became their final resting place, with markers below showing the path of their failed escape to Deep Ravine. When reinforcements arrived 2 days later, they found a gruesome scene. Of the 268 U.S. soldiers killed, only 56 could be identified. The bodies were not just left on the battlefield. They were brutally mutilated. The warriors had cutthroats, severed arms, and even removed scalps. Some soldiers had their eyes gouged out, and others were castrated. These acts were not just about revenge. They were part of a spiritual belief that harming the body would keep the enemy's soul from reaching the afterlife. Years later, archaeologists studied the remains of Custer's men and uncovered clear signs of the brutal violence. One skull showed gunshot wounds from the back and top, likely from a soldier who was trying to escape or had been executed at close range. Deep knife cuts on bones revealed that some men were scalped. Others had been struck with tomahawks or war clubs, which shattered their skulls. One particularly disturbing discovery was knife marks inside an eye socket, proving that someone had forcibly removed the soldier's eye. These injuries paint a grim picture of what happened in those final moments. The battle wasn't just a fight, it was a massacre. Even after over a century, some fallen soldiers have been identified. One set of facial bones, found near markers 32 and 33 on the battlefield, gave experts enough clues to determine the soldier's identity. The remains included the nose, upper teeth, and part of the left eye socket. The wear on the teeth suggested the person was a pipe smoker. Interestingly, the shape of the facial bones showed a mix of Native American and European ancestry, something uncommon among Custer's troops. After careful study, historians determined that the remains likely belonged to Mitch Boyer, Custer's scout. He had warned Custer about the large native force, but his warning was ignored. He died alongside the cavalrymen he had tried to protect. That unfired bullet found on Last Stand Hill is more than just an old piece of metal. It tells a powerful story. Imagine a young soldier, fresh off a ship from New York, suddenly caught in one of the most terrifying battles of the American West. As warriors closed in around him, he tried to reload his Springfield carbine, his hands shaking with fear. But before he could fire, he was struck down. That bullet never left the chamber. And now, nearly 150 years later, it remains silent evidence of his final moments. Mitch Boyer was a skilled scout, part French and part Sioux. He knew the dangers ahead, and reportedly told Custer that attacking the huge Native American village was a bad idea. Custer didn't listen, but some believe Boyer warned other scouts to escape before it was too late. This includes a story from Joe Medicine Crow's family, who say that his grandfather survived because of a scout's warning. Could that scout have been Boyer? Boyer stayed with Custer's men until the end. His remains, possibly identified by a matching bone fragment, were found near Deep Ravine. But Deep Ravine itself is a mystery. Native American accounts say that 28 soldiers died in Deep Ravine and were buried there. But to this day, no one has found their graves. Tall Bull, a Northern Cheyenne warrior who fought in the battle, described what happened in the final moments. "I heard a big war whoop. The soldiers were coming. They ran right through us into Deep Ravine, and this was the last of the fight." The men were killed in this gully, so the last fighting was not on Last Stand Hill. I saw soldiers start running down the hill toward us. Nearly all of them were afraid. Some were so scared they shot their guns in the air. This is very different from the story in which Custer and his men stood their ground and fought bravely on a hill. Instead, it suggests they panicked and ran, trying to escape, but were killed in Deep Ravine. Other native warriors, like Iron Hawk, gave similar accounts. Archaeologists have found Indian bullet shells along the sides of Deep Ravine, which means warriors were shooting down at soldiers who were trying to hide or escape. If so many soldiers died there, why haven't their bodies been found? Some historians think they were buried in an unmarked grave. Others think time and nature scattered their remains. The truth remains a mystery. The Battle of the Little Bighorn wasn't a glorious fight. It was brutal. Many men on both sides died. While Custer's soldiers were wiped out, the Native Americans' victory didn't last. Within a year, the U.S. Army returned stronger, forcing the Lakota and Cheyenne onto reservations. Ultimately, the real last stand wasn't Custer's, but the Native Americans. They won the battle, but lost their way of life. One of the soldiers who died that day was Vincent Charley, a Swiss immigrant. He was taller and older than most other soldiers, many young men with little experience. By recreating his face from his skull, historians have put a name to one of the men who fought and died at Little Bighorn. It reminds us that these soldiers weren't just numbers, but real people with stories. Vincent Charley's remains are now buried at the Little Bighorn battlefield with his fellow soldiers. Custer's body was moved to West Point, but more than 50 Native warriors and many Native women and children also died in the battle. Their sacrifices are now being recognized thanks to modern research. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a turning point. The Lakota and Cheyenne won that day, but it was their last great victory. The U.S. government sent in more soldiers, crushed Native resistance, and forced them off their lands. Today, the battlefield remains a powerful reminder of this history. The mystery of Deep Ravine remains unsolved. The truth about Michboy is still debated. But one thing is clear. This wasn't just Custer's last stand. It was the last stand of an entire way of life. And with that, we wrap up today's episode. Which story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates. See you in our next video.